Imagine trying to become famous in a country where the government decides what music people are allowed to hear, where songs in certain languages are officially restricted, where a performer's career can end not because the audience stopped listening, but because someone in an office decided the wrong people were listening. Spain in the 1960s was that country. Franco had been running it with an iron hand since 1939, and the cultural machinery of the state, radio, television, festivals, record labels, existed not to entertain people but to manage what they felt. Into this world, a young man with a guitar and no plan walked onto a stage and began to sing. What happened next was not supposed to be possible. To understand what Julio Iglesias achieved in the 1960s and early 1970s, you have to understand what Spain was. Not the Spain of today, democratic, open, one of Europe's most visited countries. The Spain of Franco, a country that had been sealed off from the rest of the world for decades, where the wounds of a long civil conflict were still raw and officially unacknowledged, where the Catholic Church and the state operated as a single organism with a single interest in maintaining order. Culture was not entertainment in Franco's Spain. It was policy. The radio played what the state approved. Television broadcast what the state sanctioned. Regional languages like Catalan and Basque were officially restricted. Performing in them was, at various points, simply not permitted. The music that was encouraged was the music that made people feel that everything was fine, that Spain was unified and proud and moving forward under wise leadership. Anything that suggested otherwise was quietly managed away. And yet, as every restrictive government eventually discovers, you cannot fully control what music does to people. You can manage the airwaves. You can restrict certain songs. You can require performers to submit lyrics for cultural review. What you cannot do is stop a melody from reaching something in a person that exists below the level of politics. Franco's cultural review offices were vigilant. They were also, ultimately, fighting something they didn't fully understand. Into this carefully managed cultural landscape, Julio Iglesias arrived. Julio Iglesias was not a political artist. This is important to understand. He didn't write protest songs. He didn't align himself with the independent cultural voices working in Spain's margins. The Catalan singers, the Basque poets, the quietly alternative voices that the state watched with particular attention. Julio sang about love, about longing, about the specific ache of wanting someone who wasn't there. On the surface, nothing could have been less concerning to a state obsessed with order and propriety. And that, paradoxically, was precisely what made him impossible to manage in the ways the state was accustomed to managing things. Because love songs, when they're genuinely felt and genuinely received, do something that official messaging cannot undo. They remind people that their interior lives belong to them. That whatever the state says about how things are, there is a private world of feeling that exists beneath the official narrative, inaccessible to cultural review offices, answerable only to the particular truth of a melody that arrives at the right moment. Julio's songs operated in that space. They didn't challenge the state directly. They simply existed in a register the state couldn't reach. He navigated the system with the instincts of someone who understood it intuitively. He submitted lyrics for review. He performed at state-sanctioned festivals. He worked within the machinery rather than against it. Not out of cowardice, but out of a clear-eyed understanding that the alternative was silence, and silence helped nobody. The Benidorm Festival in 1968, where he won with La Vida Sigue Igual, Life Goes On, was itself a state-approved event. Julio used it as a launchpad for something the state hadn't quite anticipated. The Eurovision Song Contest of 1968 was, for Franco's government, a useful instrument. Spain had been participating since 1961, not because the state had suddenly developed an interest in European cultural exchange, but because Eurovision offered something the government needed: visibility, legitimacy, the image of Spain as a normal European country participating in normal European activities. The calculation was straightforward. Send a presentable performer, perform an inoffensive song, appear at ease on international television. Franco's cultural ministry selected Julio Iglesias to represent Spain. They chose well, though perhaps not entirely in the way they intended. Julio finished fourth in London, but what happened in the months that followed was something the ministry hadn't fully anticipated. European audiences had seen him. Record labels outside Spain had noticed. And Julio, with the instincts of a man who understood that his home market had a ceiling, political, cultural, structural, began to think in larger terms. He had watched what Eurovision did to careers. He understood that the contest was not the point, it was the door. And on the other side of that door was a world that didn't require lyric review, didn't have a state radio with a list of approved songs, didn't measure a performer's value by how well he aligned with official culture. On the other side of that door was an audience that could simply listen, and feel, and decide for themselves. He walked through it, and he didn't look back. The years between 1968 and Franco's passing in 1975 were, for Julio Iglesias, a study in navigating two worlds simultaneously. Inside Spain, he was a domestic star operating within the boundaries the state set, performing at approved venues, releasing records through tolerated channels, maintaining the careful public persona of a performer who understood which lines not to cross. Outside Spain, he was becoming something the state had no framework for, a Spanish artist building an international career on his own terms, in his own language, for audiences who had no relationship with Franco's Spain at all. The tension was real, even if it was rarely visible. The tension was real, even if it was rarely visible. Haddon isn't, pride because it reflected well on the country, unease because international exposure had a tendency to broaden people's perspectives. Artists who spent time in Paris or London or New York came back with new ways of thinking. They had seen other ways of living, other ways of making culture. They became, in the state's view, unpredictable. Julio managed this tension with the same instinct he would later apply to crossing cultural borders. By being genuinely apolitical in a way that was impossible to challenge, he didn't make speeches, he didn't give interviews about freedom or governance. He sang love songs, charmed everyone he met, and continued building a career that the state could neither claim as an official success story nor justify restricting. He was too popular domestically to touch, and too internationally visible to disappear. He had found, without quite planning to, the one position in Franco's Spain from which a person could move freely, the position of being loved by everyone and concerning to no one. Francisco Franco passed away on November 20th, 1975. He had led Spain for 36 years, longer than most of his subjects had been alive. His passing didn't feel like a sudden rupture so much as the slow release of a breath that an entire country had been holding for decades. Spain didn't fall into chaos as many had feared. It began, carefully and deliberately, the process of becoming something different. For Spanish culture, the transition was remarkable. The state apparatus that had reviewed every song lyric, every film script, every newspaper article began to dismantle itself. Regional languages that had been officially restricted for a generation came flooding back into public life. Artists who had been working in careful, coded language for years suddenly found they could speak more directly. The independent cultural underground became the mainstream almost overnight. Julio Iglesias watched all of this from a unique position. He was already outside. While Spanish culture was discovering the freedom to be itself, Julio was 3 albums deep into an international career that had never needed the state's permission to exist. He had been building his world in the space beyond the state's reach, in the recording studios of Latin America, in the concert halls of Europe, in the radio stations of a dozen countries that had never heard of the Benidorm Festival. The transition to democracy gave Spain back to itself. For Julio, it did something slightly different. It gave him back a home country that could finally receive what he had become. The Spain that had launched him was not the Spain that watched him return. And the Julio who came back was not the careful young performer who had submitted his lyrics for review in 1968. He was someone who had gone out into the world and discovered that the world was larger than anyone at home had been allowed to imagine. Here is what makes Julio Iglesias' story in Franco's Spain more than a biography. It's a study in what culture does when politics tries to own it, and what happens when it slips free. Franco's state spent 36 years trying to manage what Spaniards heard, felt, and believed through the careful oversight of cultural production. It built festivals and broadcasters and review processes and cultural offices, all in service of a single goal: keeping the inner lives of 20 million people aligned with the official version of reality. It failed, the way all such projects ultimately fail, because human beings are not made to receive culture passively. They respond to it, transform it, carry it into spaces the state can't see. Julio Iglesias was not an outspoken artist. He was not a figure of the independent cultural movement. He was a young man with a guitar and an extraordinary instinct for connection who found, almost by accident, the one path through Franco's cultural landscape that led somewhere the state couldn't follow. He worked within the system until he outgrew it. He used state-sanctioned platforms to launch himself into a world where no state could sanction anything. He sang love songs in a country that managed what love songs were allowed to say. And those love songs reached people in places the review offices couldn't touch. What he built in those years, the career, the international reputation, the proof that a Spanish voice could travel anywhere in the world and be received, outlasted the regime by decades. Franco's Spain is history. Julio Iglesias is still performing. Julio Iglesias didn't change a government. He did something quieter, and in its own way, more lasting. He proved that a Spanish voice, singing about love in the Spanish language, belonged to the world. Not to a state. Not to a cultural review office. Not to a ministry with a list of approved sentiments. To the world. And the world, it turned out, was listening.